All right, welcome back. Let's take a look at the VMCA modes. What are the different modes that the VMware Certificate Authority could be potentially placed in? There is actually a default mode, and then there are some other ways of setting the VMCA up to fit different client environments. Now, there's no knob that you just tune to set the VMCA to different modes. It's really just in how you configure the system in one way or the other. The default is it's in its own root CA mode, right? That's where the VMCA acts as a root certificate authority. It will use and issue its own certificates, its own self-signed certificates to create and issue certificates for the vCenter server, the ESXi servers, and all the other vCenter services. Of course, if you leave it this way, every one of your client systems will need to then take that root certificate and place it on the client systems, right? Put them into their browser's trusted certificate store area. And so once you've done that, the client systems would then trust the certificates issued by the VMCA. That works out pretty well if you have a small number of client systems, right? How many admins are logging into your vCenter server? That might make it pretty easy to work with, right? This would entail making sure you've got the root certificate placed on each of your different client systems. That would be their laptops, their other systems that you're using to connect to vCenter with, and so on. This would also include connecting not just to vCenter, but also to the ESXi hosts. But if you've got larger number of people who need to be logging into vCenter, then having to replace or to add the certificates to the client systems can be quite a bit of a burden. So there are other choices. There's something called subordinate mode. This is where the VMCA is essentially a intermediary certificate authority, right? It's an intermediate certificate authority where that your client systems already trust their corporate CA or some external certificate authority. You make the VMCA a subordinate of that. And then essentially what that means is instead of using the root certificates that the VMCA has come with by default, instead you'll use the signing certificate from your corporate CA. Then since your client systems trust that CA, the certificates issued by the VMCA will also be trusted by your client systems. But again, that's an issue because some organizations don't allow for subordinate CAs in their networks. So another option is a very common one, which is called running the VMCA in what's called hybrid mode. In this case, the VMware CA will actually still be a root certificate authority for all the different VMware systems, all the vSphere systems essentially, which would basically mean it's the root certificate authority for the ESX servers, all the solution users. So that's basically in the internal communications of the vSphere inventory. However, the vCenter server's machine certificate is instead replaced by a signed certificate from your own corporate certificate authority. What you do here is you actually generate a certificate signing request from the vCenter server. So the vCenter server is going to need to generate a certificate signing request that you then place into your corporate CA, who then signs it, and then you import it back into the vCenter system. Now, that only took care of one of the different things. Remember, there's the vCenter server machine certificate, there's the ESX server machine certificate, and then you have these solution users, right? When it's a subordinate CA, all of those have been replaced by a certificate that your client systems will already trust. But that means that you have to have an organization that allows for the subordinate CA. If, on the other hand, you just do the hybrid mode, this takes care of the users who are trying to log into vCenter. That is now going to be trusted since your vCenter server's machine certificate is now trusted by all of your user client systems. While connecting to ESX servers, though, right, to have host client connections to ESX servers, that's still not automated. That would still imply you need to get your ESX server certificates placed on your client system. So this hybrid mode takes care of vSphere client to vCenter. It does not take care of host client to ESXi hosts. That probably might be a different number of people, right? How many people log into vCenter? I would say that's probably a greater number of people who would ever log into an ESX server directly. So for those situations, then you'd basically place the ESX server certificates mainly on the systems that need to connect to them, maybe a very small number of people, and the larger number of people who need vCenter access, that's taken care of with this hybrid mode. So let's take a look at some of these in a little bit more detail. The root CA mode is what we just talked about. That's the default where the VMCA uses its own self-signed certificate, right? Its own self-signed root certificate, which then is the CA certificate that is used to issue all the other certificates by the VMCA. All vSphere certificates are going to be created by this root CA certificate. Normally, the CA has a self-signed certificate at the root, especially if the certificate is the first one created in a new domain. But in any case, this is the default behavior. If you ever needed to change this, it's actually a pretty easy thing to do. You can, create the VMware CA root certificate. This is done when you install vCenter actually, and then any certificates that are issued by this, always certificates have, an actual expiration date. It might be 2 years, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years. Whenever those certificates expire, they get renewed by the VMCA. But you could also replace them yourself if you needed to. So that's another option. You can replace the certificates with the VMCA self-signed certificate. So you can actually do that and push them down to all the different client systems. But this is still going to require the certificates then to be saved in your client systems, right? The client systems aren't going to trust this environment natively. In subordinate mode, this is where you replace the default self-signed certificate that was created by installation. In this case, you'll typically replace all issued default certificates after implementation. This mode will require a certificate signing request issued from the VMCA. That CSR is then used in the enterprise systems, who will then sign it and generate, we'll use this to generate new issuing certificates. The enterprise CA will then sign that CSR, and then you may configure your VMCA to use this and its keys. Now, all the certificates, the vCenter machine certificate, the ESX server machine certificates, those solution users have now got they can have new certificates issued for them that are now going to be trusted by anybody who trusts the CA that this VMCA is a subordinate to. So the order here is you generate the certificate signing request by the VMCA, give that CSR to your CA, your corporate CA, who will then receive a new CA certificate. And then at this point, you go ahead and replace the default certificate on the VMCA so that it can now issue new certificates. And at this point, you can now regenerate certificates issued by the VMCA with new certs that are trusted by your client systems, provided they allow for this, right? So what's this hybrid mode? Hybrid is where your company policy doesn't allow for those intermediate CAs. What you'll do here is all you need to worry about in this case is the vCenter Server's machine certificate. So replace the vCenter Server's machine SSL certificate, that's actually what it's called, with a custom certificate that's going to need to be signed by your corporate CA. And it's of course going to be saved in the VEX database or repository. All the other vSphere traffic is going to be secured by the default self-signed certificate issued by the VMCA. So this didn't change anything with how vCenter issues certificates for the ESX servers and how vCenter issues certificates for those solution users, the services that are running internally on the vCenter system. So those are still self-signed. So again, this takes care of the types of environments where there are lots of users that might be logging into vCenter and that their systems should trust the vCenter server's machine certificate, right? This requires creating a certificate signing request issued by the VMCA. That certificate signing request will then need to be sent to your enterprise CA, who will then sign it. And then you go ahead and replace the VMware server's machine certificate with this one that was signed by the corporate CA. Now there's another option, right? But let's go through the flow here, right? There's the create the certificate sign request by the VMCA, who will then give that CSR to the enterprise CA. And all you do here is simply replace the vCenter server's machine certificate with a new certificate. This is the simplest approach, by the way, right? All you have to do is just this one kind of thing. Create the certificate signing request on the VMCA. That actually generates a file with a CSR extension. You take that file, open up the contents. It's in base 64 encoded. You copy the contents into your enterprise CA, who will then use that to issue a new certificate, which you can then now download and then import into your vCenter system, or into the VMCA effectively. So our fourth scenario, this isn't very common. This is where you forego the VMCA altogether, right? Maybe you just don't have the VMCA in your certificate chain at all, and there's no way to get it in that, implement it in that situation. So in this situation, you'll be responsible for replacing all the certificates yourself and tracking the certificate expirations, right? This is a whole much different. When certificates expire and they're issued and managed by the VMCA, well, then they'll be renewed by the VMCA. Here, on the other hand, they're not. You're basically going and getting the certificates externally and directly from some other CA out there. Now, that's bypassing VMCA. the certificates that you're getting from some external entity will still need to be stored in VEX. So VEX is still used, but just not the VMCA. So to use these custom certificates, you'll need to send certificate signing requests to your certificate provider and request a root certificate, machine SSL certificates for each machine. That's the vCenter server and all of your ESX servers. And that would include the host name and the IP address for the machine. And then 4 solution user certificates. Like I said, there's like about 26 services that need certificates all inside vCenter, but the solution users will reverse proxy for them. And so you can actually just request for 4 solution user certificates for each of the vCenter servers you have in your environment, right? Because you might have multiple vCenters. Each vCenter server will need to have their individual solution users certificates replaced by this external entity. Right? These solution user certificates should not include the IP address or the host name or the email address. Each certificate should have the name of the solution user. But again, this is not very common that customers will actually replace those internal solution user certificates. But you can see this is a manual process. So instead of having this nicely centrally managed through an issuing authority like the VMCA, you're doing this manually. That is definitely not centralized management. All right, so that's a view of the different modes. We'll take another break here, and we're going to come back and actually show you the configuration. So stay tuned for one more part to this.